coming out. This is a topic that's been near and dear to my heart for a long time. I think there's been a lot of under-rumblings about the data structures of Drupal and how entity relationships have somewhat been abused over the years. So that's what we're going to talk a little about today. All right. So first of all, make sure this actually works. Okay. All right, so this is a conversation. If you have questions throughout or opinions, raise your hand. I'll try to repeat them, and yeah, we can go from there. So we have about 35 minutes of slides and about 20 minutes of Q&A. So first of all, who am I? I work for Acquia. My name is Jakob Perry. I've been in Drupal for a long time. I started in 2005 with Drupal 4.5, and I worked for agencies. I used to work at the Drupal Association. I worked in Acquia as a support TAM, in PS, in engineering, and so I've been around a few places here. Currently, this little logo is the Content Hub logo, which is basically a technology where we syndicate content from one Drupal site to another Drupal site, and so you can probably infer from that I have to deal with entity references a lot when I'm just trying to get one single article to go from one website to another. And we'll show some of the issues we've ran into with that in a bit. So you can also find me, J.A. Perry, on Twitter. You can tweet about this and say how my presentation is awesome or how it sucks and why I'm wrong. Because this is supposed to be a great conversation. Also, this is the first time I've given this presentation, so any suggestions or congratulations to make emphasis on more or say, you don't need to talk about that, that's also awesome. All right, so first thing we're going to do is some Drupal 101, because it helps frame the conversation, sort of bring us back to why this is a problem. The first thing we want to talk about is, what the hell is a content entity? What is an entity? Because I think people have sort of misconstrued what an entity is. And so this example, for anyone has anyone here taken Java, like computer science classes? Okay, so you might recognize this. Bicycles and dogs, that's what Java uses. So we're going to use the bike example here. A bicycle is a piece of data, like a full-on piece of data. Every single piece there composes a bicycle, and it can live on its own. And so, with Drupal we have bundles, so you might have a mountain bike or a road bike or a BMX bike, but those are all sort of the same interface of a bicycle, of an object. A bicycle would have fields on it, so we have these entities that have fields, and the fields contain the data, so you'll have your shifter, your tires, all of that stuff. What they aren't is a bike pedal is not an entity in Drupal, despite what we've started to do in Drupal. And the problem with this is that component web-based design, which is awesome, and we will talk about in a bit about how I sort of propose we may architect it, has sort of started to use the idea that this is an entity, this is an entity, and the seat is an entity, and all those entities come to make a bicycle. The problem is, from a data perspective, that is not the case. And so that sort of brings us to the second piece, which is an entity reference. So if we have a bicycle and we have a person, we have these two pieces joined together. This is one piece, that is another piece, and the entity reference is the glue that combines the two together. And so you have to load up the entities of each one to render this full thing, right? But the person lives on its own thing. It can be on a car, it can be on other things. The bike can't really exist any more than like on a rack, or it can also be on its own. So when we take these two things together, here's the traditional thing. You'll notice I'm not a designer. I am a back-end person, as you can see in this slide. If we take, although this is using Unami, which is the new demo in 8.6, we have our little Trek mountain bike up at the top. Says I like biking, which is weird because bikes don't have opinions. And then we have our administrator who created that mountain bike. It says by admin. And this person has a little bio. And then we add a little entity reference on here. And we now have the author is showing a little bio. Now, the cool thing about this, and the traditional thing in Drupal, is that if I have a bunch of articles, like a newspaper, and I want a bio of my author, the bio of the author can change over the years, and they don't have to go to every single article and change them. The other thing, like if you're in a company and you decide to do a new logo and you have 1,000 articles with your logo on it, if you change your one logo, it'll change it everywhere else. Now, the first thing you're thinking is, well, wait a second, what if I want to revert back or see the history of my old articles? I can't see that anymore. I lose that data. And so we'll talk about revisions in a little bit, but that's sort of the problem, is that, like, those two paradigms are sort of opposed to each other. Like, you either are going to have logos that you can reproduce in all 1,000 articles, or you're going to have to go through all 1,000 and create new revisions of each. And so the traditional way that Drupal was architected was this idea that individuals could exist on their own. The person will grow up on his own, the bike will rust on its own, and they will have their own personalities. A bike could have a different person ride it, a person could be in a different car, whatever. So the problem is that this is okay, but let's see what happens when we start having multiple entity references. Although that looks a lot blurrier on this screen than it did before. All right, so here we have, I did a Google image search for basically many people on a bike. So we have here like 6 people and a dog on this bike, and the bike is still running, but it's probably a little harder to steer. It's probably, doesn't go as fast as it did before. It's not a huge problem. And the thing with this is that field collection is a good example of having multiple entity references. And we're starting to do this in Drupal 7. Now that everything is an entity instead of this idea of nodes and taxonomies and users, those are all just entities. And so we just start placing stuff on the node. And a good example here, for those who've used the conference organizing distribution, is that we had time slots on our events. And so time slots are a field collection. And if I have a small event that may only have 10 to 15 sessions, that's okay. But if you're at DrupalCon and you have 150 sessions, if I am saving my event page, I am now saving 150 entities. And you can guess that we would see a lot of 500 errors. And as you start piling up entity references, you will start having problems, because every single time you're saving, this one entity, you're actually also saving all the other entities. And you can see where this is going to blow up to, and you can probably guess where I'm going to get next to. Paragraphs. So how many people here use paragraphs? Awesome. Sorry. So paragraphs. The problem with paragraphs is it took this somewhat flawed architecture model with field collection and dialed it up to 11. And so everything that paragraphs has, all the use cases, all of them are valid. It doesn't mean paragraphs is still a horrible architecture, and it doesn't mean that we need to fix it. So the problem with paragraphs is we've decided that we're going to use the components of entities to create our bicycle. And the problem with that is Drupal doesn't support that from a scalability perspective. And we can see that here when we look at the paragraphs issue queue. So here's one issue. I have a few quotes from Beardeer, who's one of the maintainers. And what's interesting about this quote is that he talks about, this is a question about validation. So if I load up a bunch of paragraphs in my node, I have to validate those paragraphs still are valid. So if a field changes on a paragraph that's required, we need to tell the user on the article that, oh, hey, you need to fill out that field in the article, or field in the paragraph. And so you actually have to recursively transverse the complex object structure of any connected entity to build up the form for the entity that you're working on. And again, if you only have a few, it's not a huge problem, but as you build that up, it becomes a major problem. Because what happens is that when you're saving a lot of paragraphs, you're actually having to query the database, and you have to basically have a lock on the database to store the different entities, and as you're trying to do that concurrently, you'll eventually end up with deadlocks. Which comes to revisions. So we've talked about field collection, and all the problems with field collection in Drupal 7. The biggest thing people complained about was that those time slots that we have, they didn't change when I changed my event. And so if I changed a time slot and I changed an event, even though field collections were dependent on the event entity, they actually didn't have revision control. So you could never go back in time to see what your schedule may have been at the beginning. It was always a snapshot of the recent revision because field collections didn't have revisions. So let's take a flawed architecture model and let's add another component to it. And I am not going to talk about language because that adds even another depth of this problem. So let's talk about revisions. So for everyone, anyone not know what revisions do in Drupal? Okay, no one rose their hand, so I'm not going to go too much into it. So first of all, friends shouldn't let friends use entity reference revisions. Why? Someone's trying to get this in the core, and it's just idiotic. Let's go back to the original premise. Drupal is supposed to link different pieces of entities together. The problem here is if you're using entity reference revisions, you have to transverse all of the objects that you're referencing, and you have to introspect all of the entities that are related to all the other entities, which means that whenever you want to save a node, you have to save a new revision of every single thing you are referencing, and every single thing after that you're referencing, because you need to have a reliable way to revert.
Is this how regular revisions works, or is this a special?
This is how paragraphs works. Paragraphs relies on entity reference revisions. Okay. So, again, Beard Deer, smart guy, he uses this quote in the same issue. Every save needs to save paragraphs on new revision anyway, or you can't reliably revert. That's the whole problem with paragraphs. Yes?
One question about that, if you go ahead and you go on that model, what does it do to your database size and website performance?
What? What will it do to your website size and performance?
Yeah, like if you need to have a complete revision history, I mean, what does it do to your performance?
Oh, just wait. Just wait. The question was, what does it do to website performance? And we'll get to that, actually, in the next slide. So this is the crux of the issue. That I don't really care what great things you can do with paragraphs. That's fine. Let's figure out the right way to solve it, because paragraphs is the wrong way to solve it. And here's why. Here is 185 articles on a site. This site was only about a month old before it pre-launched. This had almost 8,000 revisions in its in just a single paragraph. And you can see the different entity IDs. They didn't have that many revisions, but in this specific one, but you can see here they're all the same thing because they're not changing. And so this is just the start of an issue. Now, 185 articles with 7,000 rows in one field is not that bad. I mean, it's not the end of the world. And if you go through and look at a paragraph site, you'll probably see that you'll have, a few rows in there. The problem is when you scale this up to 11 and you have a large customer, you end up with something like this. Now, the first preface I'm going to talk about is this is actually not paragraphs. These people knew that paragraphs was a problem, and so they decided not to use paragraphs. Instead, they're just going to use node references and use nodes as paragraphs because they heard, oh, well, I shouldn't use paragraphs, so let's use entity references to nodes and use the node system instead. Wrong. So I shouldn't poo-poo, I was going to use a bad word, on paragraphs too much because it's not really paragraphs' fault. It is how entities reference each other. It's the fundamental way of how Drupal's data system with entities and entity reference works. Paragraphs is just a symptom of it. So you can screw this up with field collection, node references, well, not really taxonomy references because you wouldn't build a whole system on taxonomy. But you can definitely do it with node references. And in this example, what we have here is 409 articles. And then they have these things, these sections that they called bands. And then they had 4 tabs on each one. And then it was 4 tabs per band, which ended up being, 116,000 band tabs. And then each band tab had basically 2 revisions. And then there was a few promos on each one, which 1.629 million revisions on these promos that were inside these tabs, were inside these bands, were inside these 409 articles. The reason why this came up to me was as a Content Hub person, we're supposed to syndicate all of this. The funny thing is one entity when we go through the dependency tree of a one entity, had up to 900 other entities that it relied on to show a single landing page. This, on the enterprise scale, does not work. So signs that you're suffering from entity relationship hell may include the following. So if you're having performance issues, your developers can no longer download the database because it's 60 gigs, because you have to buy. I actually got a new laptop, a new Linux laptop, specifically to run 2 different client sites because our Macs didn't have enough RAM to run them. When you're cache clear, when you need a cron server separate from your webs to run cron just to do cache clears because it would take down your site. Basically, what started as a small little business case and small little site idea basically turns into an architecture nightmare because Drupal is not designed to do what paragraphs does. And I should say what entity reference does, but I emphasize paragraphs because paragraphs is the thing that has enabled this bad architecture decision. And the crux of why we should all care about this is because, as Dries said, Drupal is for ambitious projects. And so if our largest Fortune 500 companies are using Drupal and are syndicating these very large projects, and then their CIO gets these email alerts saying their site goes down, and if our support team can't keep their site up, and they decide, well, maybe Drupal is not a good platform for us anymore, major part of our funding, because a lot of Drupal's module development, a lot of the work that we do is funded by some of the largest companies that are using Drupal and some of the largest sites that have large developer bases. And that's why using paragraphs as a shortcut is such a problem. Because for your small sites, sure, you can get away with it a little bit, but as you start to scale this up, not even the largest Acquia clusters can, keep these sites very reliably, 100% reliably, because we start running into issues that are just really hard to solve. So that's the end of the presentation. It's all done. We're all screwed. Bye. All right. Now, there is hope. There is hope in the... It took me a really long time to find a good jumping tree, and it was great. Anyway. Okay, so the first thing, I've sort of foreshadowed this a little bit, but I don't want to dismiss the use cases of where paragraphs and entity references are being used, because they're all very legitimate use cases. So let's go over some of them, and let's talk about some other alternatives to using entity references to try to figure out how to solve these very valid problems that we have in the Drupal space. So the first 2, those are great. Those actually are what we're supposed to do. So if you're trying to reference other content, if you're using taxonomy, if you are trying to semantically grab contextual content to show in a teaser somewhere else, or you have a view that's linking to different pieces of content, those are great uses for entity references. And for the most part, you're not going to run into a whole lot of issues there. Although I won't say never. I remember there was a commerce site that we had that had a little teaser at the bottom that allowed you to see related products. And the entity relationships went through all 20,000 products. And so we were trying to figure out, when you load a single product page, why did it take 30 seconds to load? It was because the entity reference below had some type of cascading problem where it would actually reference every single entity product in the system, which was just huge. So you still have to be careful with it, but in general, the top 2 is solved by our current architecture. So the second piece here is we talked about combo and multi-fields. That's sort of what spurred this whole thing. Back in Drupal 5 and Drupal 6, we had CCK, and the way the table structure was made it very easy for us to make combo or multi-fields. But in Drupal 7, that became harder with the field API system, and someone decided that field collections, you just embed an entity, and that's sort of what started this whole thing. And then this became even more difficult as we started to build landing pages, and we wanted to apply these dynamic layouts from our content editors, because Panels and Panelizer allows designers to build layouts, but you're pretty much stuck with the layouts that they feed you. You can't alter anything within it, and we'll talk a little about that in a moment. And then the last big thing we've seen is component web development. And component web development is an awesome way that we need to adopt in Drupal. And Paragraphs is showing that there is certainly demand for it. But we need to figure out a better way to do it, because the entity reference way to do it is not great. So first, let's talk about combo multi-fields. Here's a module probably no one's ever heard of, because there's like only 125 users. A lot of people who I've seen use Paragraphs, well, I know there's one person in this room who has seen the key value field. But the fun thing about this is when we were going through site architecture, we would notice that there were combo fields where we just needed a key value store. And so why create a field collection or a paragraph for that? There's actually a module that'll do that. And it's pretty basic. It only allows you to do two values, key value. And it can do a text box, or you can do a text field, or a text area, or a text field. It'd be cool if there was the ability to do select and option boxes, and maybe there's something in the issue queue to do it. But this is a great module for site builders to be able to use to get to solve that problem. If you're using Paragraphs to just do key values, there's a better module for that. And this uses the regular field API to give you a field that allows you to do a key value in the same column instead of referencing other entities. The next option, which isn't an option, is the Multifield module. It needs a Drupal 8 port. It works in Drupal 7. And this is actually one of the modules that isn't used by anyone that really should be in core. What this would allow us to do is take fields and embed them in a single table in the field API. So what this will allow you to do is if I have 3 fields, I could basically take those 3 fields, put them into columns through the module, and instead of referencing another entity, it would just reference a field like any other field. But it needs a Drupal 8 port, so if you are feeling ambitious and you want to work on contributing something, this would be an awesome thing to work on. The last thing is using a custom field. So how many people here have used the link module before? Okay, pretty much half people. Okay. So the link module is a custom field. You'll notice here there's a URL and there's a link text. There are 2 fields here. Building a custom field is not that hard. The field API is pretty well documented. Heck, I would probably just go to the link field and you can pull the code out of that to customize it to your whim. So for people who are developers, this is a good option. And so for those large sites that I was showing examples of, it probably is a better idea if you have a team that can do this, build a custom field instead of going through configuring Paragraphs when it comes to trying to do semantic data. So these are all related to semantic data with fields. Let's talk a little about the non-semantic data that we have with layouts and landing pages. So I guess I'll toot my own horn. I'm sort of the maintainer of one of these. So you can always use Panelizer. Why is Panelizer better / different? From a user standpoint or from a solving your business needs, it's arguably not better. But from an architecture standpoint, yeah, it is much better. So the way that Panelizer works is it stores all of your settings either in third-party settings in the config object. So if you want to have a template for, say, an article, your template can give you all the layouts that you need as well as all the blocks. And it also stores it as a field. So in the field, you have a serialized text of all the configuration of your landing page. So there's no referencing other entities. It's all stored in a singular field. However, there's a lot of downsides too. You'll see this thing, the block of doom over on the left-hand side. Blocks are stored globally. It's not the greatest solution. It does work, and depending on your use case, this is probably better than Paragraphs, especially if you're doing larger sites and you're doing templated pages like you want to template a product or a landing page, you can use Panelizer. Really, the new thing that we're going into is Layout Builder. How many people have used Layout Builder? Okay, not many. Has everyone heard of Layout Builder? Okay, still not that many. All right, so this is the new hotness that's coming to Drupal. So right now it's experimental for Drupal 8.6 coming out. We're trying to figure out if it'll become stable in 8.7. People would shoot me if I said use it now, but I'm going to say I would definitely experiment with it now, hence experimental. But I have heard some people are starting to build new sites out with it. Would I use this over Panelizer? Probably, because while Panelizer is stable, marking something stable and having the feature set that you need is two different things, arguably. One of the things we have done, though, is that if you are using Panelizer, there will be an upgrade path. Lightning, which used Panelizer until 8.6, will have an upgrade path to Layout Builder. Lightning will also support, as experimental, Layout Builder in 8.6. So you'll have an upgrade path if you start using Layout Builder. Again, caveat, experimental. I didn't tell you should do it, but maybe you should do it. Check your sites. I don't know. There's a lot of people who use experimental modules to get the Drupal 8 set up. So the next thing with Layout Builder is content blocks. How many people have used custom content blocks here? About half. Okay. So content blocks work sort of like paragraphs. I mean, they're an entity. The difference is how they're referenced. So block types will allow you to create your componentized web pieces like you could do with paragraphs. And then in Layout Builder, you can go add those block types to a section. The big difference here is that instead of doing multiple entity references, it's being added in that third-party settings, or it's being added in a field which has all those entity references put together. The other neat thing about that is because that's all going to core, we can actually figure out what blocks are being changed, and we can make a new reference based upon only the block that's being changed. So you don't have to change, if you have 10 blocks on your landing page and you change one of them, only one block will get your reference revision, not all 10 of them. The other piece here is that it just landed about a week or two ago, thanks to Ted Bowman and some others, that you can do inline blocks now. And so for people who are using Panelizer, the inline block system basically created blocks that stood out globally, would be in the block UI. It became sort of a UI mess. Now in core, what you can use is this new global tag, and you can actually make a block reusable, or you can make it not reusable. And for the blocks that aren't reusable, they're still stored in the block system. They're still stored in the block table, but they won't show up in any UIs anywhere. So the major performance hit on the block UI has been taken away. And so you no longer see the big block thing of doom anymore. Yeah. All right. So then the next piece is component-based design. This was a very early mock-up. That basically is this idea that you can click in a section of your layout, you can make these different neat widgets, and you can add them to your page. Again, this is a very early mock-up. We've sort of come a long way from that to now doing contextual fields in your layouts. So what you can have is not only these components, which can be brought from anywhere, but you can also bring your fields. So here is a article page. Here is your placed fields that you already have in your article. You can also place them multiple times if you want. And then you also have your unplaced fields, and you can drag them down and you can arrange them however you want. And this is all built into Layout Builder and Core. And then here is a demo of using it. So if you add a block, you can add sections and then add blocks. Here's your list of blocks. And so we can add our recipe, or our where we're doing our recipe header, I think that's right. And then we can place our blocks. This is actually before the inline block patch came out a few weeks ago, but it shows generally what you do. You can add new sections, and so a designer can give you a whole bunch of layouts. You can also custom design your own layouts because that whole thing is pluggable. So maybe someone will create a module that will allow you to do multiple sections, multiple layouts in a section. And then you can add your blocks to that new section. How many people have seen? I think this demo is also maybe at DrupalCon, so if you've seen this before, it'll look familiar. Yeah. So this is all using the new layout system, no entity references. It's all built into the layout plugins that we use in core now. All right, the last piece, which I just sort of hacked in here, no pun intended, was actually this thing I saw here at Govcon. Hacks is very interesting. From a conceptual standpoint, I think it basically is a replacement for CK Editor. And so if you're building basic pages with just a body area, hacks might be something to look at. Now, there's a lot of shortcomings with hacks as well. It doesn't support all the fields. It doesn't really do a whole lot of Drupal integration. There are a few, and there's more coming. But what's interesting is that if you're looking to make a better user experience for your landing pages, you can try hacks. It's not that bad. So, and certainly from an architecture standpoint, when you save your node, the most important part is that you're just saving one body field. So if you don't need semantic content and there's stuff that Layout Builder isn't giving you yet, this might be something worth taking a look at. So some conclusions here. I think the community needs to understand that really the use cases that paragraphs are trying to solve are valid, they're real. We're not trying to dismiss that at all, but we need to figure out a better way to solve them. Because there are some ways you can alleviate the paragraphs, things that paragraphs are doing, but there's a lot of things that is left to work on. And you can see through some of those examples there. The problem is that if you have a large site, it's going to become unsustainable. And so you'll run into random performance problems. And while they're trying to fix those problems, it's like trying to paddle, a kayak upstream in a class 3 rapid, right? Like, it's going to be, you're working against a fundamental architecture decision that Drupal made with the relational database of MySQL, or any relational database really. And so doing this entity reference thing, isn't really a sustainable model. The last piece there is that if you're trying to upgrade for paragraphs, good luck, because 900 entities, I don't know how you piece that together in a migration. I've heard other people talk about it. It's not that hard to migrate into paragraphs because you're just creating articles, but getting out of paragraphs I think would be pretty hard. And then as much as I am not a fan of paragraphs, don't go off and make entity references of nodes either, or entity references of blocks and then have an entity reference field on a block that goes to another thing. Like, just remember, be very careful with your entity references because every single reference has to come back to an origin, and that is the crux of the problem, not necessarily paragraphs. So, with that said, questions and debate time. So, questions, debate, yes?
Do you see all the same issues with bricks, or is there some sort of architectural difference there?
No. So do I see the architectural difference with bricks? I've not used bricks that much, but if I remember right, it also uses the entity reference model. And so it's the same problem. Yep. Any other questions? Yeah.
If you're already down that creek and turning back now, what kind of things can be done to kind of mitigate the damage?
So when I originally made this, sorry, let me restate the question. So if you're already up the creek and you don't have a paddle, what can you do to mitigate the damage? So when I originally did this presentation, I was actually going to use an analogy of restaurants because I thought that paragraphs was sort of like, well, entity references would be like the fat and sugar, and paragraphs is like having a 2,000 calorie hamburger. Unfortunately, it's like getting type 2 diabetes. Like, there's nothing like you can do. Like, you can sort of, you can handle it, but you're going to be having to mitigate it the rest of the site's lifetime, probably. Because once you go down that range, again, 900 entities, Pulling back from that is pretty difficult. Migrating away from that is going to be next to impossible. And you know, I hard to say, I wish I could give a better solution, but that's the problem we're running into here. Because if you talk about 1.6 million rows, not just paragraphs, but anything you're entity referencing, it's going to be a huge problem. Sorry. Yeah. Yes.
I fully agree with the problem you're saying about the revisions accumulating whatever, and one of the things I'm always talking about is taking out the trash when you don't need all of the trash, all of those old revisions. I have to wonder if there might be some systematic method of having sort of a second level publication, a commit, like semantic version, go to a new major version and say, okay, we're now publishing this paragraph, everything prior to that is trash. You get rid of it. Is that something that could repeatedly, it's like clearing a cache, you're clearing unneeded revision history.
So the question was, can we remove revision history in order to make this problem be more mitigated? Yes and no. So if we go back to the original part with field collections, you know, field collections weren't revisionable. That was they always took the latest revision. And so when you scale those up, you still have problems with it because as you do entities relating to entities relating to entities, you still have this scaling factor. So, you know, it may not be as bad, but you still have migration problems. You still have potential issues with your UI because you still have to load up, you know, 10, 15, you know, 30 different entities. So that's part of it. As far as removing the revisions, you could potentially do that to minimize database size, but you have to be very careful and you'd have to run a join query on all 1.6 million of those to figure out that reference wasn't being, or that revision wasn't being referenced anywhere else. And when we were going through this in core, trying to figure out how to do blocks, we were trying to figure out a way to minimize that data. And we sort of figured after you have all these revisions, there's not an easy way to come back from that. It might be possible on a smaller scale, but I think trying to take out that trash and go through that relational, traversing that relationship could be very, very time consuming. Possible maybe, but I think this is a question that the entity reference revisions queue was talking about, but they weren't able to get, it's pretty hard to solve that. Yeah. Any other questions, comments? Am I wrong? Anyone want to debate me? I was hoping for debate. Like, I'm wrong. This is a wrong solution.
I'm just really depressed now.
What did you tell your customer over 1.6 million roll of rows?
We don't tell them. We just smile and figure it out.
So you're still supporting it? You're still
Oh yeah. Content Hub supports everything that we do. Sorry, people can't see me rolling my eyes. No, we support anything. You can throw any Drupal custom site at us, and we will support it. So, yep. Might have a new laptop to try to do that with 32 gigs of RAM and the quad-core processor or 8-core. I can't remember what we got, but yeah. But yeah, no, we support it all. So, and you know, they don't have another option. So, yeah. Yes.
I was wondering if you had a solution for one of an issue with my project. So you know the diff module?
The diff module? Yeah.
You know how it shows what changes between revisions?
Yeah.
So on my project, there's an entity reference field for scheduled updates. So it's like select the date and time you want this to be published, and select the date and time you don't want it to be unpublished. So the issue is when they change that field, the entity reference field to the scheduled update isn't shown in the revision tab. So like if you did a revision, right, you can see like, oh, the title changed. But in my case, the change on the scheduled update date, like the date you want it to be published, unpublished, it doesn't show.
In entity reference revision, or is it an entity reference?
The field on the content type is an entity reference to the scheduled update.
Right. So if it's an entity reference, it wouldn't show the revision because it doesn't have revisionability to it. Yeah.
My question is, you have off the top of your head.
Yeah. We talk later though about it. Maybe. Yeah. Okay, yes.
This is less of a debate thing, but I was curious. So you showed that one site that had 1.6 million revisions. How did you deal with those revisions? I can't find. There's some modules for what?
1.6 million. Revisions for. Yep.
So what do you do in the situation when you need to delete those revisions? Like I know there's a couple modules that help do it in batches and things like that, but I've had mixed results with that, and I've had some where you can use, I think there's like a core function in Drupal 7 for entity node delete or something like that. I forget what.
Mm-hmm.
And I run it and it says there's no more revisions, but if you look at the database table size, it's huge.
Right.
Have
So-
you run into that before?
So this sort of comes back to the other gentleman's question about what happens when you're trying to call entity revisions, because some of those revisions, when you try to remove them, they don't exist. They still exist. I believe part of that problem is that there may not be anything referencing that revision ID. And so if you're trying to go through and delete a revision of, say, an article, it'll go through and transverse all the other things that are referencing that revision. But that means you'll still have a lot of things that may not be referenced by anything. On the other hand, I was trying to think in math logic terms, it doesn't mean that they're necessarily not referenced by anything. It means that at least the things that you're trying to delete that have references, it's none of those. And so when you have 1.6 million of them, you might have some that are not being referenced by anything, but to find out if they aren't, you have to traverse the whole entire tree to figure out if anyone is saying yes or no. And that's why it's so costly to do it, from a time perspective.
Gotcha. Yeah, because the issue we had is we had feeds importers running, and we handed off site client, and they turned on revisions, but that feed importer was running every minute. And it was like a runaway effect. It had like 800,000 revisions.
Yeah. So the statement was he was running a feed importer, and it was running every few minutes, and so the revisions started to pile up very quickly. Similar with migrations too. So I've seen cases where a partner will finish a site, everything looks great, and then they'll hand it off to the client to do migrations. The client does migrations, comes back 3 or 4 weeks later saying, hey, my site stopped working, because they would keep updating their migrations as they keep going through. And they'd end up with the same situation with several thousand or several hundred of thousands of revisions throughout your table. Not to mention also your page cache and other caches are exponentially getting larger. If you're doing any automated migrations or feed integration, paragraphs will start dying on you very quickly. Entity references will start dying on you very quickly. So, yeah, again. So I was going to say I didn't mean for this to be a depressing conversation, but it is sort of a depressing conversation because everyone's using paragraphs, and this conversation is supposed to sort of educate people to say, no, we need to figure out, you really got to think hard before you use paragraphs. So, anyone else? Questions? Yeah, yes?
Have you seen a guideline for a safe number of entity references or paragraph use?
So is there a safe number of uses? No. That site with 1.6 million started with a proof of concept. Well, I wouldn't say proof of concept. An example of you just have to embed a node, and you just embed this node in there, and it was only supposed to be it was like 3 content types for this one content type. And then the client got it. 157 content types later, we had, they took this tiny little amount, this little, this is sort of sustainable, this will work, it's just for one little landing page with some tabs and whatnot. They took that example and they ran with it. They sprinted with it. They pace card with it. I don't know. And so you could, but I would argue that this problem started trying to solve a small problem. And if you start with a small problem, like we do in computer science, emulation is the best flattery. And so if we start with a bad architecture that paragraph sort of helps impose, I think your clients can end up running away with it. One of my clients where we used paragraphs for one piece of the site, just one article content type, just doing one article section, because their previous CMS did the same thing. They actually had their articles divided into sections, and so it looked like a good match. Well, I found out just a few weeks later they started using paragraphs. After we launched, after we disengaged, they went to a presentation at DrupalCon, talked about how cool paragraphs was, and now they're using paragraphs everywhere. So I'm, watching my clock for the support ticket when their site starts crumbling because, they've implemented paragraphs. So I don't think there's a safe use of paragraphs. Well, there's one use of paragraphs that might, if you really could educate every single person, is that if you're doing semantic data, for some reason you can't build a custom field, and multi-field doesn't exist, and you don't have a key value field, and especially if you need to do multiple cardinality. Let me go back to that. Where is it? There. So like, say this URL, say you want multiple URLs, and you still want only one link text for some reason. Even multi-field wouldn't do that because you couldn't have multiple cardinality span columns in a table. So you'd need to have an entity for that. And that could be something where you'd use field collection or paragraphs. It's the one use case where you probably should build your own module, but essentially if you want to have unlimited cardinality, you would have to reference another entity because the field system doesn't really work that way. So that would be the one use case where paragraphs would probably be an okay solution. But again, you'd want to put like red tape and yellow caution signs and all types of stuff around it saying, this is why we used it, don't use it anywhere else. Because in that case, you would mitigate your revisions, your revision history wouldn't go crazy. That would probably be fine. So, okay. Any other questions, comments? Yes?
Can you please share the presentation slides online somewhere?
Yeah, I'll upload them to I think there's a slide thing on the site, right, Jess?
Yes.
I should know this.
And the recordings will be made
Yeah,
available.
and this will be recorded,
Yeah.
which might be one of the first times I actually watch a recording. So I love watching recordings of other people. I just hate watching recordings of myself. So, but this is a really good topic to talk about. So, anyone else? Questions, comments? Yeah.
Are there any other custom modules that you're seeing causing similar data-related issues?
I haven't personally ran into anything but the paragraphs and node reference problem. But in theory, maybe bricks would be eventually an issue. I haven't seen any other entity reference stuff specifically cause these performance issues. But I should reiterate that entity reference has been sort of a cascading problem in support for years. It's just becoming a lot greater now because people are relying on it to do so much of their fundamental site building. Yes?
So this is kind of like a big philosophical question, I guess, where you have a session, one place that says, here's paragraphs, here's how great it is, and another one says, here's paragraphs, here's the problems with that. Entity reference is a wonderful thing.
Mm-hmm.
What you're talking about is very important to talk about, is how it can be misused.
Right.
And this is stuff that kind of changes every, it evolves every 3 months, 6 months, every year, every new major version, and as modules come along. How do we as a community best, communicate this, and again, flag the old stuff for disregard this, and here's new stuff to pay attention to?
Right. So the question was, the community moves fast, and so how do we know that, a presentation talking about, say, paragraphs is the thing to do, and my presentation saying paragraphs isn't the thing to do, but maybe they figure out some way to totally transform Drupal so it is an okay thing to do, or paragraphs manages to re-architect itself in a way that works sustainably? That's a great question, actually, and that's hard because as I was doing research on this, even our own blogs at Acquia talk about how great paragraphs is. And so we have support at Aqua going, oh my God, we got paragraphs. This sucks. And Content Hub saying, oh, this is bad. Whereas on the other side, we have our own other teams saying, well, yeah, use paragraphs to build this site. I think it's good to have these sessions. I'm hoping to submit this I'm going to submit this to DrupalCon, and we'll see how that goes with a larger audience. That should be fun. Yeah. And then the other piece is, I think having documentation or comments on pages, or being prevalent in Quora and on the answer page, the other Stack Overflow. Those are important to have these conversations. The problem is that there's a lot of ways you can get stuff, and as paragraphs is organically growing, we also have Layout Builder organically growing. And I think the ways that we could probably fix this, and the people in Core probably don't like me saying this, is that Core should be enforcing best practices. And as you said, entity reference is a great thing, and that's why it is in Core. Because entity reference on its own, we need the fats and sugars to live. We need those things. We need those proteins, to be a living website. If you think of a website as a person, right? But if if your whole site's built on fats and sugars, well, okay, my diet is. But for most people, if your diet is just on fats and sugars, that's going to be a big problem. And for some sites, like for me, that works for now. But for some other sites, that's going to become a big problem. So I think Core, having Layout Builder, trying to take these business cases for paragraphs and for other uses of entity references, look at those business cases and say, yeah, we need to figure out a way in Core to solve this the correct way. We'll actually organically sort of filter out these ways that are not as good architecturally. Yeah?
I'm wondering if there would be some type of automated garbage collection, more or less like was built in the operating system, say that you could go ahead and set this, say maybe you have a filter of some type that it could use some automated cron-based system, say every set number of days or cycles for going out here, or maybe removing history, setting it at say 6 months back or something. Would that be a helpful way?
So the question is, setting up a cron to do garbage collection. Again, you might be able to do that to help mitigate some of the. I'll leave it there. You might be able to mitigate some of the issues there, especially if you're doing it often. The queries to go find those revisions would be a lot lower, and so the amount of time it'd take, you might be able to solve it. But you're working on a problem where it requires dedication to do that, because if you start to forget it, or if cron stops working for even a few weeks or whatnot, you'll run cron again and then your site will fail. So it's sort of a tricky. That would be very tricky to do. It could work for some people's, especially if you could be very on top of it. But again, trying to solve that problem is hard, and then as the problem compounds itself, trying to fix it becomes even harder. And when I mean harder, from a computing standpoint, it would take longer to do and could potentially take down your site while doing it. Yeah?
I honestly think that the revision system is kind of problematic anyway when you think about it, especially if you look at the life cycles of sites. Of course, they're short, but you had a site that was running for 30 years, and there was a node that got constantly updated by people over those 30 years, and you get, 250,000 revisions. There's no easy way to delete those revisions.
So the question is, so the question is, what maybe we need to look at the node revision system, or actually the entity revision system. So I will because we're going to run out of time here. I will end with this. I would actually say that where we're going in Drupal is a system that the relational database model is not great for. And a way to look at this is that we need semantic data. It's powerful in Drupal, but think about if your article was a document in MongoDB. If MongoDB is a NoSQL document storage system, if you could take all of Drupal's components and you could just stash it into a single article and have revisions on that article, as like this rendered piece, and then somehow have a way to relate some of that content within the article document outside of the full page view of the article, that'd be really cool. In that case, you use paragraphs as an interface because it would just be all in the same document. You wouldn't have these hundreds of tables that you're trying to reference and move around that a relational database gives you. So that might be a potential, pie in the sky solution. But yes, there are definitely some philosophical and really low-lying architectural decisions that would have to be changed to do that type of stuff. But I think it's worth talking about, and is probably another depressing whole session to talk about. So yeah. All right, cool. Well, thank you everyone for coming. I hope this was informative, a little entertaining. Yeah.